Kyle, thank you for joining today's webinar, Your Operations One Platform, a hands-on demo of the platform powering frontline operations. My name is Natalia, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. And now I'm excited to introduce our speaker. Sean Joseph is a pre-sales engineer at Tulip, focusing on educating customers on the platform's technical capabilities to help them advance their digital transformation initiatives. He leverages a wealth of experience in manufacturing, spanning both regulated and non-regulated industries, to gain insights into customer operations. Sean partners with customers to scope bespoke solutions in the service of alleviating key business pains and specializing in the validation of the value of proposed solutions via ROI analysis. And now I'll pass it off to Sean.
Thanks, Natalia. So today we're going to be talking about Tulip in action. We've got three, agenda items here. Specifically, firstly, talking about how Tulip can help unlock flexibility and drive efficiency in operations. We've then got a live demonstration where we're going to actually showcase the platform in action, and then we've got a period of time dedicated to answering questions that come up as we go through the platform. So, unlocking flexibility, driving efficiency. Today, we're going to be talking about how Tulip can support shop floor operations. In my time at Tulip, I've walked countless different shop floors and witnessed firsthand the frustrations created by inflexible point solutions. And also the reality of teams then having to resort to manual paper-based processes just to get around those legacy systems. Regardless of your industry or where your factory is in the world, shop floors today are incredibly dynamic environments. And now more than ever, they require agile tools to support them. And that's precisely why we're here today, to explore the power of a composable manufacturing execution system. And instead of being forced to work around those rigid and flexible point solutions, Tulip customers can instead adapt their solutions in service of meeting their unique needs. And then at the same time, establish a framework to foster continuous improvement initiatives in their operations. So let's dive right in here. I've got a slide pulled up that kind of showcases some of those problems that I talked about in the previous slide here about those varied challenges and frustrations facing the industry. These examples are incredibly common across the industry. So, I've heard countless customers complaining about issues related to production visibility, inventory storage, shortages, the gamut, right? And not only are these issues very, very common, they're also inextricably linked, right? Each of the listed issues here can actually waterfall into other areas and create dramatic inefficiencies in operations, right? It's, I'm sure, very obvious to the folks attending today that a lack of production of visibility can lead to inventory shortages. If you're not sure at what cadence you're operating at, it becomes very easy to not properly procure material, right? That's just one example of how these interrelated challenges can cause problems in operations, right? And in general, Tulip customers or non-Tulip customers, they tend to leverage a point solution based approach to basically go in and define various different areas on their floor where there are problems and implement point solutions in order to resolve those problems. Maybe it's an MES for establishing production visibility, or maybe an LMS for tackling training, or maybe one of the many other, software category acronyms we see listed here. Point solutions are very ubiquitous in the manufacturing space, and it's very common for customers to actually end up in a state of solution sprawl, where you'll have all these various different point solutions working independently, and there'll be gaps between them where you'll be stuck working with pen and paper. And then also, the data from these various disconnected point solutions will end up siloed and poorly leveraged. And then the last piece here is that the pure administrative work of managing all these various different point solutions can end up detracting from your workforce's ability to focus on value-add activities. On the other hand, Tulip leverages a platform approach, which allows for you to quickly solve the key pain points facing your organization today via a right-sized implementation, while at the same time providing your team with tools and frameworks to tackle future problems as they arise. You can do this by scaling an initial implementation into additional use cases or locations in your facility. So we do have this next slide here that paints a little bit of a picture of what this, platform approach actually ends up looking like. And what we can see is in this picture, key data from your operations listed, on the left of the slide here can be pulled from your existing systems of record into the platform to unsilo your operational data and provide operators with all the context they need to execute effectively. And then at the same time, you're actually future-proofing your operations because of Tulip's ability to leverage and integrate with tomorrow's technology. It's seen on the right here. And then as I mentioned earlier, that modern operations requiring agile solutions, this composable approach dramatically increases, organizations' ability to execute in an agile manner. So on the next slide here, I've talked about the platform approach. That platform approach is really composed of four main pillars, right? These are the four pillars of Tulip's platform. The first of these is the no-code app building capabilities. I'm actually going to be showcasing these capabilities in action during the demo, so I won't go into too much detail here, but at a high level, Tulip Applications and the Tulip platform is designed to allow your team, the team that you already have in place in your operations, they are the subject matter experts on your process. We want to build tools that are allowing the subject matter experts to define solutions, right? We don't want you to be reliant on a third-party software vendor in order to implement solutions. We want to give these skills and capabilities to your team. That's why we made no-code app building a core part of the platform. The other piece here is open connectivity. On that previous slide, we saw Tulip interacting with legacy point solutions to gather data, as well as future-proofing by integrating with modern technology, AI, vision capabilities, et cetera, et cetera. The openness of the platform, the ability to connect systems, devices, sensors, and machines to applications is really helpful for getting that context to your operators, right? And a key part of Tulip is making that connectivity. Another core piece is Tulip's built-in analytics capabilities, right? We can use no-code app building to develop these solutions. We can use open connectivity to connect these solutions to the data sources they need to execute effectively. And then we can use the data generated by these solutions to build analytics in service of your decision makers, right? We'll build a dashboard that will give those decision makers the data they need to make informed decisions about how to move forward with their process. We'll talk a little bit about, how Tulip fits into that continuous feedback loop later on in the presentation, but that analytics capability is absolutely a core piece of the platform. The last piece we want to call out is Tulip's world-class ecosystem. It's actually where we're going to start our demonstration is with Tulip's library, where we have countless app suites, integrations, templates, devices that we've tested to confirm compatibility. All of these pre-built components are designed to accelerate the development process with Tulip. So you don't have to build from the ground up. You can start from one of our template applications. We've got 300 plus applications, 60 different connectors to external business systems, 700 plus drivers, all different kinds of content in service of allowing you to get up and running quickly and effectively. So that's the platform. Let's now talk about that continuous improvement cycle I mentioned on the previous slide. What we have here is actually a really great view of what the life cycle of Tulip development actually ends up looking like. And so we can see over here on the left that big image is actually a quick sneak peek into the Tulip app editor, where we can actually see a drag and drop interface being used to build an application, right? So we use the Tulip app editor to build an application in service of solving a business problem, right? We then deploy that solution to the floor, and these two, images we're seeing on the right is what we end up having. Is we will deploy that solution to the floor, and it will give operators and frontline personas an opportunity to provide feedback into, how that solution is running, where there are areas for improvement, and then we'll also capture real-time process data as that application is being executed in production, and we can marry that data together in order to create, via that built-in analytics engine, a dashboard that can surface to your decision makers the correct data to make informed decisions. So you can imagine I build an application solution, and a part of that application solution is maybe a downtime tracking system. And then I deploy that solution to the floor. I find opportunities for improvement based off of feedback from operators. And then I also understand from the data generated by that and-on solution how my operation is running. Maybe I deploy that solution, and 30 days later, I discover that I have way more downtime than I wanted to have. It's an issue. It's causing me trouble and impacting my business. And, some proportion of that downtime, maybe 60, 70, 80% is attributed to one most common cause. Maybe, for example, equipment maintenance. If you have that data at your fingertips, understanding downtime is a problem and the most common cause is equipment maintenance, well, how are we handling equipment maintenance today? What can we do better? Is there a chance we could leverage a Tulip solution to solve that problem, right? That data is feeding into that continuous improvement cycle, so we can then identify the next area for improvement and where we can best use our time going forward, right? So I've talked a little bit about some example solutions here. On this slide here, we can actually see some very common bread and butter Tulip use cases. These are not even scratching the surface of Tulip's capabilities. This is not an all-encompassing slide by any means, but these are some really common use cases that customers leverage potentially as a starting point in their composable operations journey. Some of these, best hits are, digital guidance, creating a set of work instructions to display to operators so that way they can review all of the required context to execute effectively, hopefully create products that have faster cadence with less quality events, right? Then on the other side there on the top right, you could have a quality application where you can actually give your operators or perhaps an inspector the ability to log any issues that occur over the course of an inspection and maybe, post those issues to a material review board for, dealing with and disposing of those defects. Another piece is production management, right? So taking the data from these point solutions, surfacing it to your management team for better decision-making purposes, and even just understanding the current state of your floor. Those are three very common Tulip use cases. For those in more regulated industries, traceability and compliance is a common place of starting, right? So we want to, meet some regulatory requirement when it comes to understanding product genealogy, and particularly the components that we use as a part of some assembly or some batch, right? That's a very common starting point for those in regulated spaces. So those are some common Tulip use cases, but again, as I said, not the gamut of what's possible with the platform. So on the next slide here, we can actually see these point solutions that we deliver via Tulip can actually have real business impact, right? These are examples from real Tulip customers where they implemented Tulip in a quick fashion, rapidly deployed solutions. And in doing so, they impacted their organization when it comes to bottom line. We can see some of these examples here. 6 months reduction in training time for a machine manufacturer, a 20% reduction in scrap rate, and 30% increase in operational availability, for an industrial manufacturer. An increase in production capacity purely by using Tulip of 40 to 45%. As well as over here moving to the left now, an 18% increase in productivity for a luxury jewelry manufacturer. That's top line productivity, pretty powerful stuff. And then the last item we've got here, a medical device manufacturer that had a 70% reduction in defects in finished goods. So those previous slides where I saw those use cases, if we talk about that 70% reduction in defects, that could be a solution where we deployed some digital guidance to help our operators execute more effectively, and then a defect tracking solution to understand where we're at today with regard to defects and build that pipeline so that way, as a function of time, we're moving closer and closer to that golden state we're aiming for, right? So real world impact, very, very common for Tulip customers. It's a key part of the journey is making sure that you're, saving money using Tulip. So now I want to talk about, the implementation of solutions. We generally encourage customers to start small with 1 or 2 or maybe 3 interrelated use cases working together. And on this slide here, we can actually see that when Tulip talks about use cases, it actually can be a little bit more amorphous than on that, earlier slide where we saw those regimented, segmented blocks. Tulip tends to view the space as very interrelated, and we can actually see these various different use cases are actually touching other use cases. So for example, we're going to be showcasing a work construction example later on today. We can see in this chart here that work instructions in this view are touching performance management. They're touching training. They're touching kitting operations, replenishment of material, and also production visibility. And so we've got all these various different use cases interacting with one another. And Tulip solutions are really going to be geared towards what's the problem you're trying to solve, right? Once we identify that problem, we can figure out what selection from this list of use cases is going to drive the most value for your organization. On this next slide here, we can actually see that this is very, very common among Tulip customers. There's a majority of Tulip customers who have more than 10 use cases, 10 or more, I should say, use cases live in production on their floor running today. And very nearly 90% of Tulip customers have some non-MES applications. So maybe in the realm of safety, inventory, maintenance. So it's not just an MES, of course, right? That was what we wanted to showcase in terms of slideware. We're actually going to switch gears now and showcase the Tulip platform itself. And so I'll get my screen share going here in just a moment. And we will, bear with me, please. So I've got my screen share up and running here, and let me get that out of the way. And the first thing I'm going to be showcasing is the Tulip library. It's something I mentioned earlier on in today's discussion. And so we can actually see in the Tulip library, we've got countless different applications, devices, connectors, app suites, examples available for you. Worth mentioning while we're on the page, the Tulip library is a publicly available website. You can just navigate to it, library.tulip.co. You don't even have to sign in. So if you want to poke around, find some of the options we have available to you in pre-built solutions, feel free. Nothing stopping you, of course. Some of these applications are pretty neat. They're examples of design templates, unit tests of functionality, and I could even search in here. We're going to be showcasing work instructions. We've actually got a work instructions example application, which I'll pull open in another tab in just a moment here. The other thing is it's not just individual applications, it's also suites of connected applications. So our composable MES app suite, which we have for various different verticals, but I'm going to use the discrete one for today, has a whole smattering of use cases that are designed to work together as a part of a common data model. So there's, for this composable MES application suite, 3 different functions that are primarily being executed. The first of which is production management, where we've got and-on terminals, performance visibility terminals, the ability to monitor machines, all feeding into an operations management dashboard. On the inventory side, we've got applications dedicated to the movement of material throughout the floor, so that way we can, successfully feed the beast with regards to production, make sure we, minimize stockouts, right? Then on the quality side, we can actually have, applications dedicated to the inspection of units, the calibration of materials with regards to testing fixtures, for example, material review boards, rework areas, kappa management, if we want to look at these defects at a trend level, all different kinds of capabilities as a part of this application suite. And you could grab one of these areas that you're interested in. Maybe it's the production management. You could pop over to that suite, and installing that onto your Tulip instance is very, very simple. You can just click this add button and then type in your Tulip instance URL, and it will just download those applications just like you would something from the Apple App Store or the Android App Store, right? It's really just that simple. So that's Tulip library in a nutshell. I'm going to actually spend just a minute or two looking at a specific example. We're going to actually look at this example from the back end and the front end. So both the development perspective of this application, as well as the front end user experience of executing this application. But I first want to call out, in library, these items are hosted with all kinds of context about the application. So if I navigate to this work instructions example, we'll actually see in here, there's all different kinds of context about what this application is for, what it's doing. There's even a video of this application in action. So if you want to evaluate, hey, is this a good use case that I want to deploy to my floor? We've got all different kinds of tools here to help make that evaluation easier. So we're now actually going to switch gears. I'm going to take this application that we've got hosted in our library and open it up from the back end, right? So we're actually going to take a look at, as the title says, Tulip in action. We're going to take a look at that back end. And what I've pulled open in this other tab is our web-based app editor, that no-code interface we talked about for building applications. This is what that looks like. It's really very much so designed to look and feel in a way that's familiar for your operations team. So there's some similarities to PowerPoint, for example. And speaking of which, in this application here, we've got a list of steps in our process that we call them steps in Tulip, but they're very much functionally equivalent to slides in a PowerPoint. Each of these steps is a canvas that we can embed components onto in order to provide operators with context in order to execute effectively, right? And so I can basically understand from this step view the navigation of this application. Well, first I select an order, then I verify components, and then I've got some assembly steps that I conduct. That's this application in a nutshell over there on the left in our timeline. We've also got, in this familiar view, a nice little toolbar front and center here where we can basically very simply and easily add components to our canvas. So if I wanted to add a button to my canvas here, I can very quickly and easily do that. If I maybe want to make it into a help button, for example, it's really, really simple to manipulate how this component looks and feels. Maybe I want to add a little icon to it. Really, really simple to do so, right? I can, stretch and squeeze and reshape this item. I'm going to put it there on my canvas for the time being. Of course, we are not just limited to embedding buttons on our canvas. There's all different kinds of context we can embed in terms of inputs we want to gather from operators and embedded context we want to provide. On the input side, we can capture critical process checks via a checkbox. So if I want my operators to certify that they're wearing a personal protective equipment, we could use a checkbox to execute that. We can also capture data from a dropdown. So maybe in the event of downtime declaration, we've talked a little bit about andon today. Maybe when that andon is declared, I've got a single select dropdown that allows my operators to select which of the common reason codes is associated with this downtime event for tracking purposes. I can also have operators log dates, capture signatures against work orders being executed in a CFR Part 11 compliant manner. The other piece here is we can even capture images. So if the operator is running, maybe they're running Tulip on a tablet or maybe on a PC with an attached camera, we can actually capture an image directly of a good unit or a bad unit. So maybe during a defect logging step, it might make sense to embed an image capture widget to capture that context from an operator, because as we all know, a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? So that's what we've got on terms of input gathering from operators to gather that context for trend purposes. We can also embed all different kinds of context to display to your operators data that is relevant, actionable, and useful to their efforts. That could be an image of how a part is supposed to look during process execution, or maybe better yet, a video of how a process is supposed to be executed, right? Those are two examples of powerful context we can embed. We can also embed STL files, native interfaces with AI agents via Frontline Copilot, which we might talk a little bit more about later on today. We've also got the ability to embed live views of machines. So if I want to understand if a machine connected to Tulip is running or not running, I could embed a live view of that machine status, so that way my operator has access to that key process context. Another key piece of context we can embed is interactive tables. We've actually got an example of one of those right here on our template canvas, where we can actually see a list of orders that right now are stored in a Tulip table, but could just as easily be coming from some other source of truth. Maybe this data is coming from an ERP, for example. And so we can display this data in Tulip. And something that I really like to call out here is that we have a lot of power and agency with regards to paring down this context to strictly what's relevant, actionable, and useful to an operator, right? So in my ERP, I've got thousands of work orders with hundreds of fields associated with them. There's a lot of data, and it's not really super simple to parse through that. I'm sure many of the folks listening in today have had that experience where you get kind of flashbanged with a table in an ERP. It's definitely the norm. What we can do in Tulip is we can actually pare down this context. So I can say, I want to see this table of work orders, but my operator at this station who's executing this set of work instructions is only interested in some specific context about these work orders. In this case, we've specified the order ID. We want to display that, the material ID, so the SKU or model we're going to be working with, and the due date for that order. So in my backend, there are hundreds and hundreds of fields associated with these orders, but my operator at this station is only presented with the context that is relevant, actionable, useful. The other thing we can do, as I mentioned, those thousands of orders, at this station, my operator is only working on orders for a particular SKU or model, or they're adhering to a specific part of the process. We can pare down our list of orders via filters to only show orders that match some specific conditions. In this case, we're filtering so that way we're only displaying orders that are of the right SKU. If it's not of the type rotor assembly, it's not going to be displayed here, and it needs to be of the status released. So if this order is in progress, it shouldn't be in our queue that our operator could accidentally select a work order that's already in progress. If it's already completed, it definitely shouldn't be visible here. Or if it's yet to be released because we don't yet have sufficient material, it should also not be present here. That ability to pare down context is very powerful because you can provide operators with strictly the context that's helpful to them. So I wanted to call that out. Another thing I want to spend a little bit of time talking about today is how we can empower these components that we embed on our canvas with functionality. So earlier on in this demonstration, I made this, pretty little help button for us. Right now, it's not actually doing anything, of course. I made it look the way I want it to look, but I do want to actually empower this component with functionality. Luckily in Tulip, it's also pretty simple to do that. We use a method called triggers in Tulip. And so I can say, hey, for this component I've selected, I'm going to create a trigger. And for this trigger, I can specify when this component is interacted with. If some conditions are met, then I can perform some resulting actions, right? And so for this help button, I could say, hey, this help button is only interactable if a machine is in a current state, a certain state, excuse me. Or maybe only if a user is a trained user, or maybe only if a variable is in a certain state. So maybe that checkbox that we showed earlier, maybe I've got a checkbox on my canvas, and only once that checkbox has been checked, certifying that an operator, for example, is wearing personal protective equipment, maybe only then they can interact with that help button. Or maybe it's based off of where we are in the facility. Hey, if I'm logged in at the right station, I can press this help button. If I'm in the wrong place, I'm not going to bother a supervisor with something like that, right? All different kinds of, if conditionals we can use here to bind functionality to really, suit your operations as they exist. In this case, because I am building a help button, I'm actually going to leave my if conditional blank. So what we have now happening is when this button is pressed, no matter what the conditions are, we're going to perform some actions, right? And those actions are also hugely varied in terms of capabilities. We can manipulate data, such as pushing items to a table. Maybe I want to have a record updated to log that this downtime event is occurring because we're pressing this help button. We can also interact with other business systems via a function that we call connector function. So I could say, hey, I want to interact with some other business system, maybe, for example, an ERP, and I want to let my ERP know some context about what's happening. That's not particularly relevant to this help button, but I did want to show that functionality. Another capability is actually interacting with devices and sensors in the real world, So we can actually say, hey, when I'm pressing this help button, I'm kind of virtually raising my hand. I'm requesting help, to be frank about it. I might actually want to have that, virtual hand raise correspond with a physical hand raise. So maybe I could say I want to interact with a light. Now I'm working at a desktop today, so I don't actually have a light behind me, unfortunately. But I could say I want to take that light, I want to turn that light on, and I want to specify the color of that light. I can actually interact with the physical world using Tulip because of the open connectivity of the platform, right? So because I don't actually have a light behind me, I'm gonna cut this functionality out. But that actually would be a pretty good example for this help button, right? Another capability is sending notifications. So maybe I want to send an email or an SMS to a certain individual, or perhaps to a parametric individual. So I could say, hey, I'm going to automatically, when I press this button, send an email to the logged in user's supervisor, and I could specify some message that I want to send along with that. It could be parametric, but for demo purposes, I'm just going to say, user A has requested help. And so that'll be sent to the logged in user supervisor when this button is pressed. And maybe while we're at it, we're going to send out that email, but we also want to perhaps display to our operator some verification. They press this button. We want to have some immediate feedback, letting that operator know help is on the way. And I'm going to super simply and easily say, we're going to add in a text notification that pops up to our operator saying help is on the way. If I can spell correctly, that is. And I'm going to get rid of this email just because I don't know who's my supervisor today and who will, receive that email. But I'm going to leave this help is on the way trigger here. So when we press this button right now, it's actually going to send us that notification letting us know that help is on the way. So that's what we wanted to show in the Tulip app editor. I do want to spend a little bit of time talking about data in Tulip. I mentioned how we can display data generated in Tulip or in other systems, but let's talk just for a minute or two about how data lives if you choose to store it in Tulip. The way that we do this is via an artifact that we call Tulip tables. I've pulled open an example table here of defects, where we can actually see this defect table consists of a few different fields that are, of course, relevant to the defect. The first is some unique identifier, or in this case, a random string identifying that defect ID. And then we can also store against that defect who reported the issue. What was the material and quantity impacted? What was that reason code, which maybe we selected from a dropdown associated with this defect event? And then, what's the current status of this defect? Has it been reviewed yet? Where is the location in the facility where it was logged? All different kinds of fields we could add in here. The materials impacted, the constituent order it impacted, all different kinds of context. And then we also have the ability, because we have a flexible data model, to add in additional fields. So if I want to add in an additional field associated with defects, maybe a text input or an integer value that I want to capture, an interval or a date time. Maybe I want the time that this defect was logged. So we'll say defect log date. I can add that to my data model, and then I can store that data against the defect event for trend purposes, right? So I hope that this view, it's intended to be somewhat familiar, designed to be, a little bit reminiscent of, Microsoft Excel, for example. So that was what I wanted to show here. In terms of defects, I did want to spend just a minute or two. We talked about ecosystem. I spent a little bit of time showcasing the Tulip library. I also, earlier on in the presentation, spent a minute or two talking about training capabilities. Tulip does also have a bespoke university designed to help get you guys up to speed. So learning to use the app editor, it's easy to use, truly, but there is a learning curve associated with it, as with anything. You did at one point in time have to learn how to use PowerPoint. It's the reality, right? We've built Tulip University to be freely available. So you can pop in and say, hey, I want to learn how to use Tulip. We've got dedicated courses that really teach you at a functional level how to use the platform, and even certifications you can achieve after you go through and complete the courses. So not only can you train your teams to use Tulip, you can actually also get certification that they've been trained successfully using the Tulip University. So that was most of what I wanted to show on the back end. We might hit on some of those questions later today associated with the back end. If there are any of those questions, happy to come back and chat about it further. But I'm now going to switch gears and showcase this application from the front end perspective. So we're actually going to look at this application from the perspective of the operator. So I've hopped over here to the Tulip player. Before I was using Tulip's web-based app editor. We're now looking at the Tulip player, which is running as a standalone application. Today I'm running it on a Mac, but we're totally device agnostic. There's some very low bar minimum hardware requirement, but you can run Tulip on Mac OS as I'm doing today, Android and iOS, available on both those app stores. So tablets or smartphones are acceptable platforms to run Tulip on top of, as well as, of course, Windows. Windows does have the most robust device driver support, so connecting to other devices and sensors, you may end up on a Windows PC that's running Tulip in that case. And we can see we've got this subassembly application in front of us where we're actually going to be assembling this unit, and we can see those orders and all the data that's relevant and actionable and useful about them. We've basically built this cockpit for our operators to be able to execute effectively. The other thing I want to call out while we're on the start screen, that help button I built earlier is actually present here, and we can see that help notification that I built is live and running for me. That is because today I am running in the development environment. Tulip does have governance tools built into it. It's not something where you make changes and they immediately go live on the floor without any approval process. We do have approvals workflows, change log reviews. We have the ability to specify cutover dates. So it is a governed platform, but for demo purposes, it's always neat to show how you can build a solution and quickly test out how that solution looks in production. And for demo purposes, it's a lot easier for us to run in a dev environment. So rest assured, there is governance within Tulip. But as I go in and start executing this application, we can actually see that I'm going to go in and conduct this process. And we'll actually see those if conditionals to enforce process and the then functions being performed actually in action here, right? So I'm going to be executing this application as an operator. First step in my process here is to select that work order. And we can actually see when I select that work order, I can see all of the context about this work order that's relevant to me. I can see a nice little image of what the unit should look like, the quantity required, that due date, all of that context is in front of me. And I like what I see here, so I'm going to start on this work order. When I do that in this particular application, the first step in our process is to actually scan in the constituent components. So we're actually going to be performing a genealogy operation. I'm obviously, working at a workstation today where I'm going to be virtually scanning via a click here, but Tulip can very, very easily integrate with barcode scanners. It's plug and play. And so I'm going to scan in these constituent components. And interestingly, Tulip is not just capturing this data, it's actually making a determination as to whether or not this is a successful and relevant material. So if I was to scan in a material that didn't look like the right material, Tulip can actually identify that receipt code does not look like what we expect for this material. And if I was to try and begin my assembly, we can actually see some of those if conditionals in place are enforcing our process. So we can actually, because we've identified for this example product that this genealogy process is critical to our operations, we can actually enforce that in order to move on to the next step, all 4 of these checks need to be made successfully. We can bind our functionality based off of those if conditionals to enforce process in a way that fits your operations, right? And I want to call out that it's very specific. We can choose where in our process we're enforcing process. So if this is not important to you, you don't have to make it enforced. That's a choice that you can make on an individual case-by-case basis, which allows you to very nicely strike the balance in terms of process enforcement to meet your regulatory requirements and not artificially inflating cycle time, right? Striking that balance is a really powerful capability of Tulip. So I've now successfully scanned my components. I'm going to begin the next step in my process where I'm actually going to be assembling my units. So I'm now that I've, properly performed my genealogy and associated my lot codes, able to view the assembly work instructions for this process. And in contrast to the previous step, we've actually made a conscious decision on this step to not overmuch enforced process. So we're actually giving our operators the ability to complete units without necessarily reviewing each item in the work sequence. So I don't have to review step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4, and then I can complete a unit. I can complete units at whatever pace I can work at, right? That's a choice that we're making. It's a function of the product we're working with here. It's a function of the complexity of our process. So in this example application, we trust that our operators understand the process. We're giving them access to reviewable materials that they can review as needed, so they're always able to execute effectively. But we're not enforcing that because we've determined it's not necessary for us, right? That's a choice that you as a Tulip customer will get to make. Where do I want to enforce my process in order to maximize my operations, right? So I can complete my units. There's a couple other features available to us here. The next one is, of course, the ability to log defects. So if while I'm executing this work, I were to encounter an issue, I can log a defect against that work order, and I can specify, hey, what material was impacted? And I can say, hey, it was from this lot, and here was the reason code associated with it. We're using that drop-down widget we mentioned earlier, so I can select that reason code from a list of acceptable criteria. And maybe we'll say in this case, it was an issue of broken or damaged artifacts. And I can specify that quantity that's impacted. Maybe I had an issue with 2 of these, right? That lot code. Really powerful, the ability to identify these issues the moments they occur. You aren't necessarily going to have to wait to log quality events until you're in quality inspection. If your operators who know this process well encounter an issue, they can log that defect live inline. The other feature we've got here is a comment field where our operators can log whatever context they want to about this defect. I'm just going to say something, relatively simple. This isn't a very verbose description, as you can see. This might be a good example of an area of this application where there's opportunity for improvement. Rather than prompting our operators to type out a description where they're sometimes going to provide very helpful context and sometimes maybe not so good context, you could maybe add on to this application, I want to embed an image capture here. So I'm going to enforce that my operators capture an image of the defective unit. That's going to give me far more context than this, simple comment description. That might be an example of a way that we could iterate on this application. When I hit this create defect ticket, what's going to happen is Tulip is going to push those defect events into our defect table that we were looking at earlier. And so now we'll be able to trend and understand, as a part of this work order or this day or this hour, how have I been doing in terms of first pass yield? How have I been doing in terms of, production cycle time to get these units out the door? All of that data is being captured automatically as we're executing here. Important to call that out. We can see some of that data is being displayed to us. The station where we're executing our work, the user we're logged in as, that context is being displayed to us here. There's all kinds of additional context. The fact that I've spent, 5 minutes sitting on the screen while I've been chatting with you all is something that Tulip is well aware of, and you could even react to it. If you spend too long on an individual screen, you could have a pop-up show up that says, hey, it looks like you're idle. Can you confirm that you're still at the station, right? All different kinds of capabilities there. While we're in the editor, as we're starting to wrap up here, while we're in the player, as we're starting to wrap up, I do want to call out and on capabilities. I'm a huge fan of downtime tracking. I think it's really powerful because when you can't run, it obviously immediately has impact on the bottom line. Being able to satisfy whenever there's a downtime event, associating a reason code with it, right? So I hit this and on button, in order to get back to my production screen, I need to log, maybe I spend 5 minutes on the screen waiting for this issue to be resolved. In order to resolve the issue, I need to specify a reason code associated with it. So we're building high quality, high fidelity data about our downtime reasons. And so you could trend this data very easily. That scenario I brought up earlier, over the last 30 days, what's my most common downtime cause? That's a really powerful question. And Tulip makes it really easy to have that data in a way that you can actually trust. So I'm going to submit this and on, and maybe I leave it on for some period of time, but for demo purposes, I'm just going to resolve it here. The last step in this process is actually to complete all my units, which for demo purposes, we've got a button that allows us to say, hey, they're all done. If I was to try and complete additional units past the requirements of the work order, the system's actually not going to continue incrementing, right? We've said there's 19 units that are as a part of this work order. I cannot produce 20 units against a work order that requires 19. The last piece here, though, is actually signing off on this work order. And we're going to use that CFR Part 11 compliant signature widget to sign off on the data that we executed today as the user who's executing, right? So I'm going to, in this case, use a badge ID here to sign off. This badge ID screen could just as easily be a username and password. It could be an integration with your third-party single sign-on service, like maybe Microsoft Active Directory, for example. It could even be at the other end of the enforcement curve. It could be an integration to a third-party biometric system. For example, one of our partners, NIMI, have biometric wristbands that allow you to truly authenticate who a user is at a given point. So if attributability is a key concern for you, we can meet you where you're at. It doesn't have to be a 4-digit code. I'm going to sign off on this work order, and in doing so, it'll bring me back to this front screen where I can begin the next item in my process. That was pretty much everything I wanted to show on Tulip on the front end and the back end. So maybe now we can switch gears and start focusing on any questions that have come up here.
Yeah, and now we'll jump into the Q&A. Just a reminder to everyone that if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A tab on the right. And we'll get started with our first question. So, Sean, we talked about, how Tulip can be implemented across your operations to solve a ton of problems. How do you prioritize which pains to solve?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's honestly maybe one of the most important questions with regards to a Tulip implementation. There's so much the platform can do. So arguably the most important question is, what should we do? How do we prioritize? That can be a bit of a difficult question when you're, not yet a Tulip customer, because you might live in a state of hidden factory where you don't actually understand the key performance indicators that are driving your performance. But in general, selecting a use case is largely predicated upon business pain. So where in your operations are inefficiencies causing the most pain, causing the most impact on your organization's bottom line? That's probably the area where we want to start. And our services team and our delivery team can help work with you to get to insights in terms of what solutions make the most sense for the problems you're facing today.
And kind of in that same scope is when your process changes, how do you go about updating? Your process isn't going to stay the same. So what does updating that process look like?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's really just as simple as iterating on the solution in the Tulip application editor. So based off of some feedback or some change in process, you want to iterate on that app solution. It's really, really simple to use the app editor to change your solutions as a function of time. I've seen one Tulip customer, they'd been a customer for a few years, that were running on version 195 of an application. So it can be a very, very rapid process to iterate on solutions. In regulated industries, it can be a little bit of a longer turnaround because of validation needs. But in general, on the Tulip side, it's very, very simple to update solutions.
Yeah, and as we start getting employees of these customers kind of ramped up on development, and we worry in the short term, about bandwidth to start, how do you propose managing kind of that ramp up?
Sure. It's a great question. We've got a couple different motions in terms of services. Kind of designed to meet you where you're at. We definitely encourage that citizen development approach. Like a big part of the platform is the no-code app development capabilities. So we do encourage customers to develop that skill internally, maybe using University, learning how to fish. And we do have a services engagement dedicated to that, where we'll basically teach you how to build in Tulip while also delivering with you an initial scope solution, right? But we do also have the capability to leverage more turnkey services where you can, have a whole project developed by the Tulip team, or perhaps leverage a third-party partner, one of Tulip's approved partners, to develop that solution instead, if that's more amenable to your organization.
And how long does it typically take to implement a composable MES kind of compared to a traditional MES?
It's a great question. In a vacuum, it does vary from customer to customer. I've seen some customers, it could take, upwards of 6 months. I've seen some customers deployed and live on their floor in a matter of weeks, which is, startling, but real. It's happened. And it's not even all that uncommon to deploy very quickly. It's very uncommon for Tulip deployments to take as long as traditional MES solutions, because traditional MES implementations, there's so many different motions in place. You first need to document every single requirement for your organization. You need to document it properly. You need to communicate that information to the external services, software team. You need to make sure that they actually understood that content. You need to wait for them to develop that solution, and then you attempt to deploy that solution. In that duration, that traditional software development lifecycle, there's a lot of communication that's happened, which means that there's a lot of room for miscommunication, and a lot of time has passed. And it's very common for the problems your organization is facing to actually change over the duration of a deployment. And you may end up deploying a solution that is no longer of good fit for your current needs. So the fact that we can move a lot faster with Tulip is a huge asset and a differentiator for us.
Absolutely. And talking about kind of how the speed that everything is moving, everyone is talking about AI. AI is kind of the future right now. So how's Tulip building AI into the platform?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. There's honestly so many different areas that I struggle to list them all off. I will attempt to. We do have AI translations of applications, so you can translate applications to automatically via AI to the operator's preferred language. We have the ability to interact with AI agents as we execute applications. So maybe in that and-on screen we showed earlier, maybe I've got a chatbot where my operators can ask questions about how downtime events like the current one they're facing have been resolved previously. We've also got the ability to use AI to build analytics based off of data in Tulip. So that table we saw of defects, I could have hit a little button on the top right of the screen, which will be in the recording if you want to review it later, where you can actually pop in and ask a question in a plain text question saying, hey, I'd like to understand a Pareto of my defect causes over the last 30 days. Tulip will use an AI agent to actually build that visualization for you. So that's another neat capability. While we're at it, I know I'm missing some. Here's another one, AI Composer, the ability to build applications from a starting point of a PDF. So you could take some of your legacy process documentation, maybe a PDF SOP of work instructions, for example. You can actually take that and, excuse me, you can upload it to Tulip's AI Composer, and the AI Composer will build the bones of an application with all of the content from that PDF hosted automatically, and it'll dramatically reduce the time to go from legacy solution to Tulip app solution. It's something where I can upload it, it'll spend 10 minutes thinking about it, and I'll have these bones of an application with all the text and image content associated with it embedded in that application. So I think I've run the gamut there. There might be something I missed, but
I think
the next question.
I mean, we're constantly growing our feature set, and I think to Sean's point on that is, with Tulip compared to maybe using a non-manufacturing focused app editor to build your apps, is we are GXP compliant. In regulated industries, we're really focused on stability, on data privacy. So that's kind of, as we talk about AI, we're looking at it in a very human-centric and a privacy-focused way. So with that, I think that's all our questions. So thank you so much, Sean, for joining us. Thank you, everyone who joined our webinar today. And if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to the Tulip team. Thank you all.
Thanks so much.